Hello, this is Chris Ott, and this is part 4 of this series that I'm titling The Psychic Emergent Universe. Now, I've pretty much, over the last 5 years, and the 100 videos that I've done, and the second book that I wrote in 2001, I've done a pretty good job. I feel good about the job that I've done, I should say, of communicating the idea that I've had for about 20 years. And in some ways and fashions, I've had it all my life. But it really, in stages, as I learned and I studied, I was able to communicate the idea. And that is what I've called the evolution of perception in the past. And if you look in the show notes, I link to my papers about that in 2 books. And I'm now talking about sort of the essence of that idea, which is that the world is psychically emergent. That means psychogenic. It has a psychogenic core. That's what creates the world, both the physical and so-called mental objects that we perceive, thoughts and emotions, and physical objects like pens and so forth that have weight. All that is created by an evolution of perceptual schemas in a what I don't like to call a mind, but I will today because it'll help you to understand what I'm saying. But there's a reason I don't like the word mind. I've tried to use the word psyche or the logos, or there's a lot of other words that we could use, and intelligence, an intelligence that pre-existed the world, that evolved the schemas to see the world, and then we emerge out of that process of perceptual operations that evolve. We emerge in that. We're actually caused by that, and then we create our own individual one. So when you look around, there's 2 sets of qualities to the world. What are called primary qualities, which are the same for everybody. They're shared. And there are things like the number of objects and their size and relative to other objects, and also the laws that govern them, like gravity. Everyone who goes to measure those things gets the same result. So that is explained because those formed in that, I'm going to use the word mind, in that first original mind, one mind. But then we evolved out of that, and now we have our individual minds, and we have our own individual schemas, and we usually call those judgments. So while I come into a room, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who will count the same number of objects in a room, but they'll make different judgments about those objects. And this is caused by the schemas that they have individually gathered. Now, schemas, of course, you can see that in my writing. The perceptual schema, the way that you organize your own individual experience. So, if you think that's a bad thing or a good thing, those are judgments. But that there is a thing that you're judging, well, that's in the individual mind. So I hope you see this, that in a sense, the original mind is imagining, and then you emerge or supervene out of that process, and then you begin your own process, or everybody does. And so then we get into arguments about what's going on. Should we go to war or should we not? We have judgments. And they're based on our own personal evolution from the time we emerged. So you could call this, and it's been called this, a dream within a dream. So it's not that I'm laying in bed dreaming, but in the sense in which I have these schemas that are making my judgments. That's essentially my imagination, and then I am in the imagination of this one first mind. Now, the reason that I don't like the word minds, and the mind of God, although that's roughly what I mean, the mind of God, everything's imagination in the mind of God, you could say. That's how Berkeley would have said it in the early 1700s. That's the way they talked at that time in the Enlightenment and philosophy. But people are post. But the reason that I'm using it is not because I don't believe in God, because I do, but because what I'm trying to get at is a monism, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. This is something that is going to be kind of. It's going to be hard for me to get it across. I hope people get it. If they don't, I'll have to do this again because it's that important. Because since the beginning, as people like this idea, they always fall into a certain trap, which I'm trying to help people to avoid and see it as a trap. I talk about this as early as my very first book 20 years ago. So, and it is that they want to break the monism. They want to make things complicated. I'm going to show the way my mind works. Let me show something. If all this fails, I'll do it again. Probably will because I haven't been able to see an easy way to explain this. First of all, when you have a lot of complexity, okay? All right, a lot of things. What I mean is, there are natural laws, and there's their judgments, and there are people, and they appear to have minds, and there's animals, and there's things like space, and there's time. All these different things and phenomena in the phenomenal world, the world of our experience. We can pick out millions of things. Now, when we go to explain them, how they came into existence, and explain their cause, this is why I've talked so much about cause, and I did a whole series on cause. This is, if we are not careful, we do not make any progress in explaining any of this if our explanation also has all these parts and things that we've made up. These are called mythemes, I've called them, or in my series called Baba and the Future. But I've also, in my second book, I eventually decided to just call these theoretical occult entities. Occult meaning that you don't perceive them. They're just theoretical. So we give them a name and we call them the cause. And we come up with a whole bunch of these. And this is what people have been doing for thousands of years. To explain all the complexity of the phenomenal world, they've come up with all these made-up non-phenomenal things you don't perceive. So the way we explain things traditionally that we perceive is to make up things we don't perceive and call them the cause. But we got a lot of problems with that. That is not a monism at all. That is a plurality, but it's not just a plurality of what it is you're trying to explain. I accept that there's a lot of plurality to the phenomenal world that I'm trying to explain, but when your explanation is just as complicated or even more complicated than what it is you're explaining, you haven't succeeded at anything because you've added to the sum of things that need explaining. That's what I said in my very first book. That's what it says. I think it's on the back of the book. We end up coming up with things, and now we have to explain them. So how has that helped us? We started out with our world to explain. We end up with our mythemes that have no explanation because they're just made up. I mean, they seems to work, for some people, their ideas. So this is why I don't like the word mind. Because let's say I'm trying to explain what I perceive, and I say, well, these are all, ideas in a mind, my mind. Well, where's this mind? I've made up a mytheme. To explain the objects that I perceive, I've called them ideas, and I've come up with a mind. Well, where's the mind? I don't see the mind. What are you talking about? Now, if I want to see how this mind works, since it's invisible, can't be perceived, science doesn't apply because science is empirical. So, what have I done? I've done nothing. I have not explained anything. What we have to do, you can do whatever you want. Nobody has to do anything. But if you want to succeed at explaining the complexity of the phenomenal world, we have to move backward toward simplicity. So if we have a complicated phenomenal means that which you perceive, both internally and externally. thoughts and dreams and things like cups and saucers. Those are all phenomenal. If you want to explain this complex, almost infinitely complex, phenomenal world we call the universe, we need to find simpler principles and move backward until we come to that one principle that can explain them all. If we can do that, we haven't added to the sum of things to explain, especially if this thing is absolutely beyond question, that we can actually prove that it is a something. But it's not a thing. It turns out it's an activity, it's a process, and that is perception. You can't deny that you're perceiving right now. Or we couldn't even be talking about the phenomenal, because the phenomenal is that which we perceive. So if we're talking about the phenomenal world, there obviously is an activity called perception that is occurring, and if you go to deny that you're perceiving, you enter all kinds of self-contradictions, and it just falls apart. So, you can't coherently deny that you perceive. You could deny it, but it wouldn't make any sense to anybody. All right. Now, so in this system that I've been describing, this psychic emergent, you have this psyche, which we're not going to call a mind, because what's that? I don't know what that. I mean, a mind kind of comes along later. I kind of have a mind. What I mean is I have all these thoughts, and they kind of hang together, and I identify with them as my own, and so I call that, the contents of my mind. But those are all just sort of metaphorical. I mean, you're not going to really find a mind, but that's fine, just figure of speech. But in the beginning, there was no such thing. If there was, you'll see the problem in a moment. So what I've always done is I said all there is seeing and ways of seeing. The ways of seeing, the seeing is symbolized by an eye. I always do that. But it's only a symbol, and I don't mean eyesight, but I use an eye as the symbol of it. The perceiving, the action, the activity. And actually, in the previous video, number 3, I explained that originally there wasn't even perceiving, because there was just the intelligence that has the capacity to perceive. But as it awakens, and there are reasons that it awakens, because it's part of its nature to want to know reality, and so it begins to imagine that reality, and it ends up imagining the universe, and it does this entirely through schemas, these lenses. Okay? Now these lenses, again, they're not things, and they're not separate from the seeing. They're ways of seeing. Like if there was a bear, and he's in a circus, and he's riding a bicycle, we would say, well, he's riding a bicycle. Well, if he's riding fast, is that another thing? Now there's two things. There's the bear on a bicycle, and there's the fastness. No, it's still the bicycle riding of the bear. It's just that we have added an adverb to describe what was already there, the riding. So if he rides slow and he rides fast, it adds or subtracts nothing from the fact that the bear is riding a bicycle. So similarly, these schemas, or ways of perceiving, add and subtract nothing to the perceiving. They only add and subtract to the content by organizing in a different way the content. Okay? So I've been describing this for 20 years. If you don't know about this, then I don't know why you're watching this video. This wouldn't be the one to start with. I'm kind of taking care of loose ends now. I'm not starting from the beginning. I'm at the end. So I'm covering things that could be misunderstood. So, just like in the previous part, doing the same here. So now, what people want to do when they see this idea, they even like the idea. Wow, that really works. That's amazing. And then they want to add something else. Something else that they imagine in their mind. Something that they've perceived. Something from the phenomenal world. Now remember, when I say phenomenal universe, I mean your thoughts too. Your concepts. That's part of the phenomenal world. That's phenomenal. How could a concept exist except conceived, right? So it's conceived. So they're taking what these lenses are producing, whatever it is, something comes to mind, some concept, and they want to put it back here, behind the process, in the beginning. But it can't go there. This is why this only works as a monism. And while these people are always meaning to help, they want to help me by adding something they came up with, which they got from here, and they want to add it here. But it can't be here. It can't be here. They're not understanding the idea. And it's not, both can't be true. It becomes a contradiction. You can't mix this simple monism. That's why my first book was called A Simpler Theory of Everything, really. It's working back to a very simple concept, seeing in ways of seeing. That's what produced the world. But if you want to put any kind of a mind or some kind of, stuff from Hinduism, you want to go and dig through those books and add in Pran and Akash and all this stuff, which just means matter and energy, which both supervene out here. They want to put them back here. They don't understand what I'm doing. And that's okay. Who am I? But don't think you're helping with this. It's like, I had this analogy, imagine that there's a patient and he has all these terrible problems with his health. And it turns out, as you begin to talk to him, that all those problems with his health were caused by doctors trying to fix him. That happens. Sometimes the best of intentions lead to things kind of just getting worse. And that's what's been going on for 2,000 years in philosophy, is people have been not even realizing what they were explaining, which was the phenomenal world. And then they've been taking things from their imagination and putting them back here. And that's what I've called mythemes or occult theoretical entities. Okay? Even matter is a theoretical entity. Because see, all you have is your experience, and experience is mental. I don't know if you know that, but it is. So matter is just this theoretical entity that some putting back here, but it doesn't make any sense. Because how could it produce perceiving? They don't know. That's why they can't explain consciousness. All right. Now, I've been very straightforward that the source of this idea comes from three main people, but also others. And I think it was in part 2 where I went over those at the end. But George Berkeley in his book from 1710, and Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, and his book Critique of Pure Reason. I think that's like 1788. And then Meher Baba, who wrote in the early to mid 20th century. And those three is how I get this, okay? And I wanted to, this isn't the same as any of those three, but it is consistent with certain things that they teach. And with Meher Baba, I would say it's fully consistent with what he taught, although it's not a repetition of what he taught. It's a way to understand what he meant. And I wanted to read a quote by Meher Baba. And I want to explain it, and it's going to be a little tricky. First, I need to talk about space. Remember that in this system, there are the first schemas that organize our experience are time and space. And then the natural laws, which are relations of time and space. And then finally, certain physical objects supervene, and then we have a body, which is a physical object, and that we have a brain and nervous system, and we begin to perceive color and sound that wasn't back here, but we sort of add it to the sort of quantitative world that gets produced by these laws. And I went over that in a lot of detail. I think in this series, or it was in the one on metaphysics, but I think it was in part 1 or 2, where basically you're looking at a mathematical world, but then your sense organs are interpreting it and perceiving it as smell and sound and color, etc. what we call the sensible world. But this is just more fundamentally, it's just in the mind of God, if you want, if that helps. It's just number. By the way, that's not original. That is one of the oldest ideas of philosophy. It comes from Pythagoras, who was before Plato. So let's go. So what was I going to say now? This quote. Okay, so we're talking about space. All right. A lot of people today have a very confused idea of what we mean by space in philosophy, including some philosophers, but mostly not. Space is sort of that which exists between objects, the empty area, okay? So space doesn't have to be three-dimensional. It can be one-dimensional, two-dimensional. So like, for instance, if I take a point and another point, and I say that the shortest distance between those 2 points is a line, okay? So that's actually one-dimensional. It's one measurement, okay? You can't measure a point. You can measure location relative to other points, but you can't really measure a point because it's infinitely, it doesn't have any size, okay? It's just a theoretical distinction. Here is what we mean. And then, but from here to here is what we call extension. And in the Enlightenment, they understood that is we understand that in terms of space. So how much space from this point to this point? Well, maybe 18 inches from here to here. So, by the way, in geometry is all conceptual. It's not objects. It's conceptual. Right now I'm talking about concepts. The concept of a point, the concept of a line, which is the shortest distance between here and here. And this is conceived in space, in terms of space. And so if this is the lens that produces the quality of space, the perceptual quality of space, then it's out here, and it's because of this lens that we can conceive things in terms of space. So we conceive things in space. And anything you conceive spatially if it's visual, in your imagination. And anything, anything that you can conceive is even more fundamentally is conceived in terms of time. If you were to remove time and space, you couldn't conceive or perceive anything at all, because everything is conditioned by time and space. But we're just talking about space right now because the quote talks about space. But I didn't want you to just think of space like outer space, like where a rocket goes, but also just the space from one point to another. Or, by the way, that's one dimension, one measurement. Dimension means a measurement. So from here to here is one measurement. But then if something was a piece of paper, you wanted to mention the height and the width, then that would be two, and that would be called two dimensions, two measurements. Then if you want to know the height, that starts to create three dimensions, and that's a third measurement. And then you have height, width, and depth, and that creates a box, and now you're dealing with three measurements, coordinate, and you have in a coordinate system you have a three-dimensional object. The idea of the third dimension being like a place, that's a misunderstanding of geometry. That's very modern. It comes from the book The Time Machine. It's true, in the 1800s. That's the origination of the idea of dimensions like we talk about today. So, and he introduces the fourth dimension. It's all nonsense. It's total nonsense. Time is not a dimension. Time is just time. It's a measure. It's a measure. You could call it that because you measure the duration as well. So you could call that a fourth measurement if you wanted. But in geometry, it doesn't really apply to geometry. Geometry is talking about shapes. So now, let me read the quote now. When mind soars in pursuit, that means, it's imagining. When mind soars in pursuit of things conceived in space, you can only conceive things in terms of space. Anything that you conceive is conceived in space. I don't mean it's out, we're not talking about space like Star Trek. We're talking about the schema of organizing experience in terms of space and these distances from here to here, an empty space. Conceived in space, it pursues emptiness. Why does it pursue emptiness? Because remember, all this is an illusion. I never hid that point. That's the point of all this. All this is illusion. This is reality. The seer, the seeing, the perceiving, the intelligence that is perceiving. That's the real reality. But that which is perceived, the phenomenal, is an illusion. It doesn't exist. It's like a dream. A dream doesn't really exist. It seems to, while you're asleep. The same with waking life. It's a dream. But it's a dream in a sense in the mind of God, if you want, if that helps. Now, it pursues emptiness. But when man dives deep within himself, okay, that's where he's going to find that original reality. He experiences the fullness of existence, which is what the mystics call mystical union or God realization in Eastern thought. The idea of merging with God or becoming one with God or becoming the God that you always were, but latently. So, let me repeat the line. When mind soars in pursuit of things conceived in space, it pursues emptiness. But when man dives deep within himself, he experiences the fullness of existence. So these people who have tried to help me with this system, they come to me with these ideas conceived in space, or ideas conceived in time. And then they don't even understand that they are conceived in space and time. And then they want to put them before space and time, which they cannot be. So, if this lens is the lens of gravity, and all events that occur perceived through this will follow the law of gravity, and they will fall at a certain rate, and etc., according to the mass, and etc., the mathematical law that governs those objects when they're attracted. Okay? But that gravity isn't back here. It's produced by this. So how can it be back here? So I'm not going to go over all the examples, because if I did, I'd be teasing those people that made those suggestions, because they meant them in good faith. But I'm trying to talk about this in general. Now, that's the last kind of like point that I have to make. I have to make that point, otherwise people are going to come along and work on this idea by adding mythemes to the thing, and they're thinking they're helping, but they're really creating a problem. They're creating dualisms or pluralisms that don't work. And it's agreed, by the way, in philosophy, that dualism, which was a substance dualism, the idea that there's a mind substance and a material substance, doesn't work philosophically. And that was Descartes tried that. And that's one thing philosophers agree with, and I agree with them too, even the materialist philosophers. Essentially, there has to be a monism, because a dualism creates contradictions. It doesn't work. So either the world is fundamentally mental, if you want to use that word. I don't like it, but that's okay, because it connotes a mind, and I don't know what that is. I mean, I know what people are trying to convey. It's something that thinks, but why? Why can't we just have the thinking? There's a book called Thoughts Without a Thinker. Go read it. Although that's not really the subject of the book. It's about Buddhism. So a monism is either everything's mental, like this system, everything's psychic would be, or psychical, I prefer those words, or everything's physical. But that really doesn't even work, because what are we talking about when we talk about physical? If I talk about this pen here, well, that's an experience, which is mental. And I talked about this in the series on metaphysics, but I think there's 20 parts. And I went over this and over this and over this, that our perceptions are are within us. And so if there's some kind of material thing, well, where is it? It's not in your experience. And it's certainly not a part of scientific discussion, because science is empirical and a theoretical entity, independent and outside of your experience, some weird way, which has never been articulated what that means, what they call the outer world. I talked about that constantly in that series. So this is covered. So really everything is mental, and it's kind of undeniable. They've tried. The 20th century was a good college try to make things work out through a theoretical frame. And since I've been talking about this, to my surprise, well, maybe I've gotten better at explaining it. I don't know. In some ways I think I've not. I was recently looking at some of my earlier videos from 5 years ago, and it's perfectly consistent with what I'm saying now. But maybe I've gotten better. But people don't have a problem with this, which is what I suspected. I believe that the younger generations, like my own and younger, won't have a problem with this. And I said why, partly. It's that it's part of our conditioning, the whole idea of things being virtual. And the movie The Matrix, it had some problems in that movie, but it did a lot of good to make people go, oh wow, if the world is our experience. So if it wasn't real, how would you know? Well, that's good. There were a lot of movies that year, 1999, and I've listed them. They're all back there in these videos. I went over it and over it. That was sort of a trend. It's mainly in the year 1999 and thereabout. That's the year The Matrix came out, 1999, but also a lot of other films that dealt with reality and illusions. So anyway, I hope I don't have to redo this. I'll look at it while I'm doing post-production, and maybe I will go, oh, I have to redo it. Not good. But then I'll do a better job, and I'll either leave both or just on the new one, or maybe this will be good enough. I hope so, because I want to get to the end of this whole series, and I have some ideas for the ending, and I'm hoping that it'll just be 5 parts. But anyway, that concludes part 4 of this series. I'll see you next time with part 5. Good luck. Have a good week. Take care. Bye-bye.